Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Retirement Cafe podcast, which is brought to you by the Retirement Planners MFP Wealth Management. Today I am sat opposite a gentleman who joined me live on the panel at the Retirement Cafe last year, where we discussed funerals and probate. Yet we get to all the exciting topics that you all want to know about. Simon Head runs an independent funeral directors in Bournemouth called Head and Wheble. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you, Justin. It's nice to be with you this morning.
So, Simon, could you tell me a little bit about yourself and your background?
Certainly, I'm Simon Philip Robert Head. The boys in our family always have three names. The girls only ever have two. I don't know why. But then we haven't had a girl in our family for 5 generations, so we're a little bit boy heavy, I suppose. My grandfather, George Head, began in 1926 in Bournemouth. The family had been here for 3 generations before that. So Grandad looked after the business, and then he passed it on to my father, Philip, who joined it after his service in World War II in the Navy. He came back, and then it's my turn to look after it now. And we now have 2 of our sons. We have 2 sons, both in their mid-20s, James and Robert, who are with us full-time. Wow. My wife, Catherine, works in the business. We've been at the Lansdowne premises since 1926. We're a small family business with traditional values. But these days you have to have a bit of a modern twist if that's what your customer is after. Right.
Tell me a bit more about the modern twist then.
Well, I suppose in the old days it used to be always somebody died more or less at home, right, or in hospital, and the service would be a service in church followed by a burial, almost always. And then cremation started coming in the 30s and 40s. More overly, after the Second World War, cremation was a more accepted form of... Sadly, it's called disposing of a body, because we are people in our lifetime, but the way we recognise each other, of course, is in our physical form. But when the spirit clearly goes, you're left with what we recognise as the shell, and that needs to be disposed of.
Okay.
Slightly different way, yes, I can see that look. You weren't expecting that, were you?
No. So, one of the things I'm not sure I would know, what if someone, I was just mentioning before, a pal of mine's mum has just died. He's kind of out of the area. He's got to travel back home. He's got to sort that out. So she was on her own. Where does he start?
Well, one would assume he'd been contacted by the person who was responsible for letting the family member know. The first question you need to ask yourself is, where actually has the person died? Does the body actually need to be moved? So if, for example, the lady has died in hospital, then there's no pressure immediately on him to make further arrangements.
Right.
The paperwork needs to be sorted out, and the hospital administrators will do that. If she's died in the community, then the body will need to be moved to a funeral director's, or if the doctor is unable to ascertain straight away what she's died from, then the coroner will be informed and the body will be moved to the public mortuary. And again, that's pressure off in terms of him having to make instant decisions which are going to affect what he's going to do in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Right. And so does the doctor make those, help him with those kind of decisions, or?
Certainly you can't do anything until you've got a medical certificate of cause of death, which is issued by the attending doctor in the last period of time.
Right.
If a doctor has seen the person within 14 days of their passing and they know what they've died of, then they can issue a full medical certificate, and then you register the death, and then you can make funeral arrangements.
Okay.
There are other complications which I'm not going to bore you with because they are endless at this stage.
Right, okay. So what point do they call you?
At all various stages, sometimes in blind panic, and the first thing you always say to him is just take a breath. Okay, everything's going to be fine. It may take a little time just to sort out, but we can help you through with what stage you are at. We can ask the various questions which you might not think of, and just work through things with you carefully and slowly, so that eventually you, and in this case Mum, can have the funeral arrangements that you've possibly thought about.
Yes. And that's the thing. At what point do you start thinking about your funeral arrangements?
Well, the more modern thinking is sooner rather than later, but you don't have to. It doesn't suit everybody.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all with this. We're all individuals in life as we are in death. Some people can cope with life situations better than others. And we often get people phone us saying, well, I need to do this, I really need to do this now. okay, then let's make an appointment, let's come in, and often I'll sit as I am with you and I'll chat with somebody for 20 minutes, half an hour, won't write anything down, and just try and get a feel for where they are in their preparations for, actually formalising their arrangements.
Yeah. And so do people need to make the decision of whether they want to be buried or cremated or what have you?
Yes, they do.
Prior to them dying, or
yes, they do.
Okay.
The law has changed now, but some time ago you actually had to put it in your will that you wish to be cremated.
Yes.
Otherwise, you were automatically buried.
Ah.
That is now not the case, but it is sensible because the paperwork is quite different. To arrange a burial, the paperwork is much less than it is with a cremation. And you can't actually move somebody from a hospital, for example, until they know whether it's burial or cremation. So that is something that is you need to think about.
Yes. And of course, the big question that I wouldn't have a clue about is what does it cost? I mean, you might say, well, it all depends on, if you want 6 white horses or I don't know, it used to be called a pauper's grave type of thing, but what does it range from?
Well, it would range probably anywhere from about £2,000 upwards.
Right.
I mean, the sky's the limit. I mean, you can spend silly money on silly things,
right?
But then that's in the eye of the beholder. It's a bit like love, it's in the eye of the beholder. But it doesn't have to cost crazy money. But it depends on what your aspirations are. Often depends on your relationship with the person that's died. Is there a little bit of guilt in there somewhere? Are you going to make practical decisions, or are you going to make emotional decisions? Planning something is important, but it oughtn't really to be in the forefront of your mind all the time. So if you do get a thought, write it down, put it in a piece of paper, on a piece of paper somewhere separately, and then revisit that if you get another thought. My wife Catherine's up to about 3 days of music at the moment. That's nice, I ought to have that at my funeral. Well, I mean, we've got 3 days of music, so she's going to have to hone that at some point.
You presumably give them family.
It's a slight exaggeration.
You might get family rates.
Well, I'm not sure about that. It depends how she behaves. And of course, if she's still the current Mrs. Head when she passes.
Well, of course.
Don't read anything into that, by the way.
No. So we talk about unusual requests. What could you give me an example of something? What is not normal? I suppose.
Yes. Well, what is unusual to you might not be unusual to me or to the people that come to us.
Sure.
Family backgrounds are important, and what is important to them, it depends on their upbringing, of course. I suppose odd. Well, where do I start, really? You can get some very colourful characters that want to do things that are slightly off the wall. Now, as long as it's not illegal, then it's doable.
Right.
And most things aren't illegal. I mean, you've got to be pretty daft to try and do something illegal. It's rather difficult in a normal sort of situation, really. You can have any type of music. You can virtually have any type of coffin these days. I mean, for example, you can have a cardboard coffin, and it can be decked in all sorts of colours, flags, or anything you want. Visions of different animals or people. I think we had one with Napoleon on it at some point, on a charging white horse. Now, that's pretty unusual, but it's doable because it's all imagery. The majority of people that come to us want something fairly straightforward, which means it's a coffin which is a flat lid, it's plain sides, it's all fitted properly inside and out. But you can also spend a lot of money on caskets. Burial, you have a lot more in terms of size and shape and costings and actually what it's made of. With a cremation, the funeral director actually has to make a legal declaration to the crematorium authority that he's not presenting something to them that they can't burn effectively.
Right.
So there are smoke emissions issues with that. So your limitation is slightly more with cremation than it is with burial. And if the coffin's too big, you can't get it in a cremator and you have to bury it. And if it's too big to go in one grave, you have to buy 2, which is rather expensive.
Yeah. Gosh, there's a lot to there's a lot to think about. I got asked the other day, and I'm not massively familiar with them, I must admit, but I did get asked the other day whether this lady had, she came to a retirement cafe live event, and she said she'd got a reasonable level of assets and seemed to be all great, etc., and asked me about a couple of housekeeping issues around her money. And then she also said, do you think I should get an insurance plan? this one was from the co-op, and I'm sure there are other ones available. Is that a good idea? And I must admit, I said to her, to be honest, I have no idea. I think from what you've just told me, you have significant assets and you won't have much, your estate will not have much problem paying for it. We understand that you can present the bill to the bank, and they should be able to settle that for you. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is. I had a spell before I came into the family business. I did 3 years with Barclays Bank, which was a great experience for me in terms of how a bank account worked, etc. But yes, if you have a funeral account, it can be presented to the bank, who would be quite pleased to pay it. Certainly if it was perhaps even slightly more than what was in the account, it was an easier way in those days for the bank to close the account on behalf of the estate. But the funeral expenses can be paid out of liquid funds. It doesn't have to wait for probate.
No.
But obviously if funds are in something less tangible, then we have to wait for probate, or the family or the individual would pay for it out of other funds.
And have you found the insurance? I suppose you're not in the business of purchasing the insurance. I suppose you may be in the position of dealing with the insurance companies if the event of someone presenting an insurance plan to you.
Yes, I mean there are two ways with this. You've got a life insurance policy which pays on death, and then that sum of money is paid into the estate. That can be used for all sorts of things. Now, going on slightly as a tangent from that, with a prepayment funeral plan, basically it is an insurance policy, but it's with a funeral tag on. And that has implications as to who actually is the plan provider, but who is the provider of the funeral service. And the two sometimes marry up.
Right.
In many cases they don't, because the insurance policy is a national policy. And again, like I said earlier on, it's no one size fits all. We're all individuals. But because it's a national policy, it has to have certain guidelines that on an individual basis, and funeral directing is really rather parochial. What we do in central Bournemouth is going to be different to perhaps how they might do it in the forest,
right?
Etc., etc. So if somebody is of a mind to do an insurance policy, it might be better to do it without any tag-ons that they might not like. It's better to have your choice of funeral director, I would have thought, if you're going to actually give them instructions on how to proceed on their behalf when they're no longer here to tell you.
Yeah, so this message of writing down what you want and having a conversation and giving guidance to who you're leaving behind is key here.
It is really. It falls into two camps. You've got the pre-arrangement. I have quite a lot of people that phone me up and then we meet and then they give me their instructions, but they're not interested in the prepayment side of it because they don't want the restrictions of that. And also it means that if they move area, they haven't got the rigmarole of trying to change it. That is one of the benefits of a national policy, is that they have the same arrangements with whomever the funeral director might be. Right. The difficulty with that is that the funeral director doesn't know who you are. And some people tell you something, and sometimes they don't actually mean that. They actually mean something not completely different, but slightly different.
Yeah.
And it's knowing the family background that can often help you in that situation.
Sure. Now, I've come across natural burial a few times recently. What's your thoughts around that?
Well, a death is either natural or unnatural.
Yes.
These days it seems to me that everything has labels. Well, I was never really brought up with labels. You are who you are and you can be who you want to be. So labels can be a bit restricting. I don't have any particular difficulty with any of the labels. But it depends how somebody talks to you and what they want to do.
Yeah.
They say, well, I want a natural death. Well, that's actually not in your hands.
Sure.
Well, it might be.
Well, of course. Of course, absolutely. So, that's been fascinating listening to you there talking, Simon. What are the kind of key messages that you'd like our listeners to take away when when thinking about this subject, if they're listening over their morning cornflakes?
Well, yes, or morning cornflakes. Haven't had those for a while. Well, I suppose the most important thing is actually nothing to do with the funeral. Is actually, if you haven't got a will, please do a will. It makes life very, very much easier and legal when you're no longer here. Also, you may need to look at lasting powers of attorney. I know this is not my subject, but it actually is very important.
Yeah.
In terms of your funeral arrangements, if you like the sound of something, whether it's you've come across a reading or a poem or a piece of music that you like, write it down. And this can be ongoing. Your list is probably going to be quite long. Not everybody goes to church these days, so we don't have so many hymns, but you might have 3 or 4 hymns that you think, well, that might be rather nice. So write it down. If you want to formalise it in terms of a prepayment, be very careful who you do that with. Do your research.
Right.
Might be better to at least go and talk to a local funeral director rather than a group. Depends on your aspirations, depends on how much money you want to set against it. But there isn't probably any one situation where a funeral prepayment will cover absolutely everything at the point of need.
No.
The other thing that's important is that you know that the sum of money that you've paid for a prepayment is going into actually doing that service, not into administration costs. So again, be aware of how that might fit together and whether that fits what you want it to do for you.
Yeah.
Whatever the sums of money are, that's almost irrelevant. It's what is it going to do?
Fantastic. So wise words there from Simon. Well, I really appreciate the time for coming to chat to me today and this morning. You're always very engaging when what can be quite a dry, delicate topic. So thank you so much for coming and having a chat.
I'd just like to leave you with one thought. This just popped into my mind. There was a lovely lady whose husband was rather on the lazy side, and when he died, this is a long time ago, and this isn't a gag, this is actually true, and the lady's still with us. She put her husband's ashes in an hourglass and she turns him 3 times a day because it's the most active he's been in years. Anything goes.
Fantastic. So to find out more about Simon's business, then head to the show notes at theretirementcafe.co.uk, where you'll find the useful links to his contact details and his web address. If you'd like to continue the conversation about topics we've discussed on the podcast, please search the Retirement Cafe page on Facebook and follow our page. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review on iTunes or share with your friends and family you may think who also may enjoy the podcast. That makes a real difference for us. So this is brought to you by MFP Wealth Management. And so until next time, this is Justin King helping you feel more informed in your retirement.